All right, welcome back. So we had just talked about how Lincoln refused to act on emancipation through the first year of war. But there were a lot of runaway enslaved people during this time, and they did start flocking to the Union Army during the war. Initially, they were returned, but in 1861, the Army adopted a policy of claiming them as contraband of war, so that way they could not return them. Later on that year, Congress passed the Confiscation Act, which declared any enslaved workers that were used for military purposes that fell into Union hands would become free. And then in 1862, we have the Second Confiscation Act, which stated that any enslaved people of rebellion supporters would be freed. Now, Lincoln encouraged gradual emancipation in border states, calling it inevitable in the course of war, but that was ignored. But eventually, in July of 1862, Lincoln discussed with his cabinet a proclamation to free enslaved people. They did decide, though, to wait for a major military victory, and the goal was to make the war about freedom versus slavery. So this proclamation was issued in September 22nd of 1862, and the victory at Antietam provided that opportunity. So Lincoln announced that all enslaved people in rebel territory would be freed unless the seceded states returned to the Union by January 1st of 1863. So there were some exclusions here. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free everybody. There were still some Union slave states. None of those people were freed. There were areas of the Confederacy under Union control, and so none of those people were freed either. These were just areas that were actively in open rebellion. So about 830,000 people were excluded from this proclamation. The justification for that was that this was a military action only. But when it did happen, it did redefine the nature of war. So it was successful in that. Turned it from a war that was being said it was fought over states' rights, and it turned it into a war about freedom versus slavery. So when that happened, European favor rushed to the Union. All of a sudden, Europe decided that they did want to see the North win this. The Union itself had some mixed reactions, but the main thing here is that it did redefine how the war was being talked about. So let's talk about some different war experiences. For African Americans during the war, at the outbreak, enslaved people started undermining authority, started making their own hours. Sometimes they would not work, sometimes they would run away. 1 out of 7 fled to Union lines and ended up living in refugee camps. And these camps were not ideal either. So they were overcrowded, they were full of disease, there was limited food and shelter there. And the US government started putting many of them to work for very low wages, basically earning little more than room and board. So equivalent almost to slavery. There were soldiers as well. So after emancipation, they were allowed to join both the Navy and the Army. And there was some resistance to this, especially in the Northwest. A lot of African Americans themselves were unsure if they wanted to fight in this war. But one person who argued for it, who was a prominent figure, was Frederick Douglass. He said that it would be hard to deny citizenship for citizens or for residents who had a veteran status in this war. And about 200,000 African Americans ended up serving in the Civil War, which was about 10% of the manpower, and most of them were formerly enslaved. There were segregated units and unequal pay until June of 1864. And they were given very undesirable posts at first, and had to fight to be able to fight in battles, so like cleaning latrines and taking care of the dead. But then once they were allowed to fight, they were known to be like very brave, fierce fighters, highly revered, and the rate of death was 40% higher than white people who were fighting, largely because they were being sent to the front lines, and the people they were fighting, clearly very racist, so black soldiers were an easy target for them, so they had a much higher rate of death. Now let's talk about life in the South. You know, there was this blockade going on, so there was a lack of food, especially in the last 2 years of the war. Cotton production they tried to turn a lot of cotton growing into growing of food, grain and livestock, but that didn't help a whole lot. There were also a lack of European goods, and a lot of factories in the South, even though there weren't very many, they converted to war goods, and they made a lot of progress there, but they still were not entirely self-sufficient. But they did much better with their factories than they did with agricultural development. So like on their eventual surrender, they had plenty of guns and ammunition, but they didn't have any food. Women in the South had increased roles, much like in the North. There are a lot of female spies, smugglers, but there are also plenty of work sewing and knitting, and then working in agricultural areas as well. The South was very upset, so they had to pay heavy taxes to pay for this war. And these are people who are very much against a central government, but here they are paying taxes. They had their property seized often. The Confederate dollar was worthless. There was a draft going on in which the wealthy slaveholders were exempt, so that was unfair to a lot of people. And there was talk of, you know, the central Confederate government and Jefferson Davis destroying states' rights, turning it into a dictatorship. So people were fairly unhappy in the South at this time. In the North, unhappy as well. So the financing of the war was a big issue. In 1861, we saw the first federal income tax. In 1862, a comprehensive tax law, and like over $2 billion worth of bonds were sold, like these debt certificates, to try and finance the war. And we have a national banking system that was instituted, many, many tariffs. Women in the North did have more opportunities than in the South. They were able to run farms. There was a lot of factory work available to women. Even like government clerk jobs started opening up, and then a lot of nursing as well. Excuse me. All right, so for soldiers, soldiers were in camp about 50 days for every 1 day of battle. So most of their time was somewhat idle. They did, you know, partake in a lot of military drills, but life in the camps was really unhealthy. So there was rampant disease, there was a lack of food, and this was all worse in the South because supplies and food were blocked, of course. And there was a ton of boredom. So some unhealthy habits were picked up: drinking, gambling, prostitution. Somewhat more mild habits were picked up, like religion started taking up a lot of time. And there was a lot of carnage, of course, as well. Over 750,000 people died in this war, which was about 500 lives per day. And part of that is due to the new technology. So they had rifles with these new bullets that increased the range in which somebody could be shot and killed. And some people would try to hide from people at home, or like just wouldn't tell them how bad the war was. So like kind of playing down how awful everything they're seeing is when they're writing home to family. And family members, you know, they wouldn't hear from people who were fighting in the war for a long time, and then sometimes they never heard. So there was questions of the grieving, like where are these people? Did they disappear? Did they die? There were a lot of questions left unanswered. So the war started winding down. In the spring of 1863, it was looking good for the Confederacy. They won the battle at Chancellorsville, but then Stonewall Jackson, one of their best generals, was shot by his own men. And this was really a not only strategic setback, but a morale buster as well. That was quite a shock to the Confederate soldiers. Let's go to Battle of Gettysburg. This is July 1st through 3rd of 1863. And there were early successes for the Confederate Army here at Gettysburg before even like all the troops were there. And Ewell, who was now in command of Stonewall Jackson's troops because he had passed, was told to take Cemetery Ridge if possible. This is a strategic location. Stonewall Jackson, if he had still been there, would have charged and done it immediately. Ewell did nothing. So that was the first mistake. He didn't seize an opportunity to take Cemetery Ridge. That was day one. Day two, most of the troops are finally at Gettysburg. The Union Army has this really strong defensive line, and General Lee was urged to find a better position, but stayed put. And so both sides had a lot of heavy losses that day. Lee was urged to withdraw again and find a better spot, but he refused. And Lee had thought that he inflicted heavy casualties and demoralized Union forces, and he did inflict heavy casualties. So he organized forces for a coordinated attack the next day, and this is seen as like the second mistake, was Lee not really doing that great a job on day two. Day three began with Union victories led by General Custer. Around 1 p.m., Lee's plan that he had formulated went into effect, and so the Confederates started heavy artillery bombing, blasting the Union center lines, and the Union responded as well, so they're just bombarding each other. So this went on for about an hour, and then the Union stopped firing. And so Lee, thinking the Union was disabled, running out of artillery, ordered 3 divisions to move in. And so over 12,000 troops marched up Cemetery Ridge to go take it. But it had been a trick. The Union Army was not out of ammunition. And once the troops got closer, cannons started firing on the troops. Not just like cannon shot, but just pouring musket and rifle fire into them as well, just blasting the troops as they marched up the ridge. And about half of those soldiers that were trying to take Cemetery Ridge died. Lee begged his troops to rally. He said, "It's all my fault. You must help me. All good men must rally." There was no rally. He ended up getting most of his men back across the river. And so that was a definite Confederate defeat. Lincoln wanted General Meade to go after and destroy the retreating troops, but Union forces were badly wounded and exhausted, and they did not go after to destroy those who were retreating. So it did end up being a major blow to the Union. They did lose 25,000 lives, which was about like 1/3 of their force. So that's the Battle of Gettysburg. Let's talk about General Grant real quick for the last part of part 2. General Grant had tried for months to capture Vicksburg, which was on the Mississippi River. And he started boldly sending troops inland away from supply lines, stealing food from Confederate farms instead of relying on the supply lines. And that was not usually done because it was way too risky. But he started doing that. On July 4th, Vicksburg surrendered, so it worked. Did it again, and July 8th, 4 days later, in the same manner, they took Port Houston, Louisiana. And with those 2 victories, the Mississippi River was completely in Union hands. They also took it upon themselves to go to Chattanooga, rescue Union forces, and after seeing how successful Grant was, Lincoln convinced that Grant should be in command of all Union armies, and so they moved Grant east in March of 1864. And so he was now the commander of the Union Army. Grant was successful. He recognized the need to have a group effort to coordinate East and West armies better. And so he decided that he would attack Lee in Virginia. He would have General Sherman march across Tennessee and then go into Georgia. And he told Sherman to get as far into enemy territory as possible, damage all resources, so a scorched earth campaign. And so in May and June, there was heavy fighting and heavy losses, but Union came out ahead. And at the Siege of Petersburg, which was Richmond, Virginia's last remaining link to the railroads, Sherman had like gone there. He had fought all the way to Atlanta, and Grant again had taken Petersburg. So this was looking like the war was ending because the Union was really strangling the South at this point. We'll pause here. We'll finish up with a part 3. It'll be very short, I promise. See you soon.